G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. In this video, I'm going to walk through how to use the grease pencil to your advantage when doing some hard surface modeling, along with a few tips and tricks on how to use the modifier stack to your advantage when modeling things such as guns, props, buildings, any hard surface object really. Now, I've seen a few videos like this in terms of time lapses online where people have used grease pencil objects to model things, but never have really gone through the effort of really explaining what's going on here. Now, Blender's grease pencil object is really useful as a early look dev tool. It's super useful because you no longer are required to really rely on something like Photoshop to sketch out your ideas, but even better still, you can do it at any angle you like. You can actually add angles to your sketch in 3D, so you can actually build around the sketch rather than having to line up the sketches before you start modeling. So as you can see here, I'm just using the grease pencil object in front view just to really just sketch out the most basic of shapes and then work on refining those shapes and adding those contour lines where I would actually start to add the model into. So I'd actually start to model around those contours. But for now, I'm just working inside of front view, just sketching away a orthographic sketch of the side view of my gun. I'm adding the details and those contours where I need them. So for instance, I'm adding the thumb grip, the place where the screws go, where the safety handle goes, that sort of stuff. Really simple things that you can sort of copy from real world objects, such as real photos, or from other people's sketches. Or if you find some concept art that you think is cool, you can always try to adapt from those concepts. Or you can just have your own sketches that you have lying around on your desk or something. So as you can see here, this is where the real magic happens. So with grease pencil objects, you can actually mirror your grease pencil object and turn it into a 3D sketch. And this is going to be really useful for getting the right kind of mass, essentially, that I'm going to trace around. So I'm actually working out the mass of my gun in terms of thickness on both the tops, the bottoms, the sides, you name it, because I can actually actively edit the grease pencil object on a point-by-point basis. And then inside of front view, using the 3D cursor as a location for where I'm building out my sketch, I can actually add even more depth to that sketch in 3D. So I'm actually adding like the nozzle, for instance, in 3D as a sketch that I can actually build around in Blender. How cool is that shit, man? I mean, honestly, this is one of those most like I wouldn't even say it's underrated. It's just not well known enough yet within the 3D community on how to use this stuff effectively. And this is just a really simple example of how it can be used. For instance, just dragging the trigger button, the trigger on the thing closer together so I know exactly how thick that trigger will be when I model it, without having to actually have multiple images sketched out. It's so goddamn useful, honestly. So straight away, I can start to model in my geometry based on the sketch, the thickness of the sketch. How crazy is that? So now I'm actually using modifiers to determine like the bevel. So rather than actually beveling it permanently or destructively, I'm using bevel edge weights to determine the edges that I want to bevel. And then I'm using the bevel modifier with that edge weight assigned to create the bevel that I want. And then using proper edge flow techniques and just knowing, having a decent understanding on how to do that sort of thing, I'm getting the right shape done. And then I'm using booleans of another shape to cut out the shape of the little rivet, the little edges that I have on top of that gun. Now you can get plugins that do this a little bit easier for you, make the interface a bit faster, but ultimately they all do the same thing. They're just helping you add things to the modifier stack faster. You can do it just as easily on without any plugins as well. And check this out. With the Solidify tool or Solidify modifier, I'm using the sketch from the grease pencil to determine the thickness of the gun barrel. That stuff is really cool because I already had the sketch in 3D to sort of line up that thickness instead of having to sort of guess it. That's the cool thing about using grease pencil as your base or as your underlying sketch rather than like a 2D image, which would have taken you twice as long to sketch because you had to draw it twice, front, back, side, up, down. Now you just do it with one view and you're good to go. So yeah, I'm just filling out the inside of the gun barrel with a secondary shape. So basically I just copied the original piece and then filled it. And I'm using more bevels, or not bevels, booleans to cut out the shape of the gun barrel underneath at the back of the gun. So basically all of this stuff is a non-destructive workflow on, you know, creating those sort of shapes. It does make the geometry a bit shit, but because it's not actively going to be animated like, say, something that's more organic, it doesn't really matter as much. Plus, it makes a nice, clean, smooth surface regardless. Now, learning how to use the modifier stack effectively does take a little bit of effort, a little bit of trial and error. However, as you get used to it, now as you start to understand how it works, it becomes super effective at creating non-destructive workflows. Now, at its current state, or its most basic state, the modifier that precedes the one that it follows affects each one. So the first modifier affects the second one, which affects the third one, which affects the fourth one, and they all sort of add up to each other. Now that may change as geometry nodes matures and gets more and more feature heavy, but in its current state, with modifiers being what they are, this is how it works on a most basic level. Obviously, geometry nodes will change that in the future, and it will potentially be easier to do this sort of stuff, more dynamically at least. Now, as I add more detail to this gun, I do still have to be fairly aware of how I'm going to model it on a, you know, in the basic sense, like how I'm going to cut the edges, how I'm going to merge verts, that sort of thing, in order to maintain its form. So that's really up to you. It's really up to you how to teach yourself how to do that sort of thing. And there's whole courses on hard surface modeling in terms of that regard. But in terms of Blender's methods of using modifier stacks to make that a little bit easier, it really does help. So again, I'm using the sketch, the grease pencil sketch, to figure out even the depth of this gun barrel, the depth and the circumference and all that sort of stuff. And if I didn't have the grease pencil object there to help me, it would take way more time, a way more trial and error, a way more, you know, sort of testing and fiddling around to sort of guess what I want, rather than, you know, just going forward and just getting it done. This is the real advantage of using grease pencil objects here. Again, I'm using the solidify tool here to work out the thickness of the barrel of the gun. In this case, I do apply it because I want to add some extra variation to the inside of the gun barrel. And, you know, if I really want to be fancy, I could still use modifiers for that, but like, it's just easier to do it this way. And after I do that, I just extrude out using face selection, just a pattern that I like for the gun barrel. Now, there are still times where I prefer to model in directly the detail into the model rather than using modifiers. So for instance, you'll see as I add more detail, slightly more detail to the barrel of the gun, I'm actually actively modeling it in rather than using a boolean. I could have used a boolean, but I wanted to keep the geometry fairly clean for some reason. I wasn't sure why I did that, but I figured it would just be faster and easier to have a bit more control over the verts. So I decided not to use a boolean in this case. but because the geometry is still fairly clean, I was able to get away with it. So this is about where I start to actually model out the handle of the gun and the trigger. And you can see here that like it is so much easier to do when you're working with the grease pencil sketch. A side note about how I got that bevel to look, not bevel, that curve to look so smooth. I used a subdivision modifier and then assigned certain edges of that little trigger bit with a crease. So give it a crease of 100%, assign the crease, and add a subdivision modifier, and you get this really nice smooth curvature. It's super clean. But yeah, without the sketch to help me out, I would have been fucking around with this for ages, trying to get the right thickness, just being like really pedantic about it. But with the sketch, I don't have to think about it. It's really great stuff. So for the trigger of the gun, it's pretty straightforward. All I did was use an extrusion of quads and then added a bevel modifier. Nothing too fancy about that. And then I added a little bit of a bevel modifier using edge weight, bevel edge weights on the top of the trigger there to add a little bit of a bevel. And that was it. You can do all of these things through the edit mode of any object that is a mesh object. So you can add edge bevel weights, creases, hard edges, those sort of things. It's all done through the edit mode when you right click on an edge in edit mode. So yeah, nothing too complicated there. For the handle of the gun, it's basically just an extrusion of quads in mirrored mode. So I added a mirror modifier. And then I'm just cutting away what I need to make the shape of the handle, and then just merging it using clipping and merging in the mirror modifier. For the little thumb grip, I'm adding a few edge loops around the circumference of where that thumb grip would go, and that edge flow will help maintain that shape. So that's how I made that work. So understanding basic edge flow helps here. Again, this is one of those things that it just comes with practice. So understanding how edge flow works really does help to get the right shape you need for any given object or circumstance. So the rest of the modeling process is pretty simple. It's basically just working out where I want to add more bevels, where I want to add a few more details like screws and shit like that, and just refining the edge flow where I need to get the smoothest effect I can get for those given areas. After that, it's mostly about shading. So you can see in the time lapse that I do a bit of color testing with some basic PBR shaders, nothing too fancy. I'm not going to even bother texturing this because it's not really that necessary for the film that I'm working on. And then I bring in my my toon shader, my custom toon shader, to do the rest. And then I light it up and get it done. A lot of people are asking how I do the toon shading, and I will upload my work in progress shader for this video just for you guys to play with it. It's nothing too fancy. It's definitely not that advanced. It's really basic, but it does the job for what I need it for. So that's all that matters to me. So yeah, give it a go. If you want to check it out, feel free. Otherwise, just try and do something different. I'm going to leave it to the rest of the video to show you what's going on, because my mic is fucking up. So with that in mind, enjoy the rest of the time lapse, and until the next video, catches and have fun.